My name is Ndaba. I serve at East Africa Re as the actuary there. With me I have my good friend and my former boss, Sheila. So you can be friends with your boss. So today we are going to take you through this paper or presentation on using earnings at risk to manage risk in insurance companies. First, Donald has stated that Darlington could not make it to this event, this task event, but we hope he'll be there next time. All right, so we're just going to start it with, I'll start it with a few questions. Who has heard about earnings at risk before I mentioned it? Oh, nice, I see you there. Yeah, that's nice. Who has used it in their work, in their daily work? Wow, that's nice. So it just proves that we need to continue this presentation. So now we are hoping that today we are going to meet two goals. We are going to, every one of us will understand what earnings at risk is, and once in a while you're going to use it in your insurance companies to make decisions, and especially during the business planning period. I'm sure we've all done business planning. I think it's done during the Q3. So come next year, this one will be a useful thing to have in your work. All right, so we're just going to go right into it. So on the agenda, as stated, we'll have understanding earnings at risk, and then we'll look at the risk measured under earnings at risk. Then we are going to present a case for earnings at risk as a coherent risk measure, and we're going to look at the pros and the cons. Anything with an advantage has a disadvantage. So we're going to look at the pros and cons of earnings at risk. And the good thing today is everything that, we have what actuaries look for, practical examples. So we're going to have practical examples using 3 Kenyan companies. So I hope it's going to be useful. All right. So on understanding earnings at risk, so the first thing about earnings at risk is that it's a downside risk measure. It's a measure of downside risk. So downside risk is the probability that your earnings might not be what you expect. So earnings at risk is a measure of downside risk. Technically, it is a measure of the variation in earnings that you're going to have in your projected earnings over the next 12 months. And how we get that is we look at what could happen in a 1 in 10 year period. So you look at your books historically, maybe over the last 10 years, what has been happening, what could go worse. So earnings at risk calculations comprises that. And simply, and I need to state that this is the overly simplified simplification, is that simply it's there's a 10% chance that your your IFRS profits will be lower than, will drop by the amount that you've calculated as your earnings at risk. So that's an oversimplification because it's not given that an event that happens 1 in 10 years will happen, will have a 10% chance. So it's an oversimplification that you would use when you're taking through your management through such conversations. So just to put everything into context, we're going to give an example. So say in your company you've said we're going to have profits, say in 2024, of about 80 million. Then you calculate your earnings at risk and you say it's about 10 million. So there's a likelihood, 10% chance, say, that the profits that you'll end up making is actually 70 million instead of 80 million. So what happens, I believe in most companies right now, is we do our business planning, but we might not look at, okay, what if we are not able to meet that number that we had talked about? So what? So what earnings at risk does is it helps you to look at the what ifs that could happen in the future, and you try to mitigate them before they happen. Good? Hey, are we together? All right. So the next thing is we are going to look at the risks that are measured under earnings at risk. So with what we mostly know as actuaries is risk-based capital, that's where we'll mostly be involved when you're looking at risk. And remember here we are looking at earnings at risk, how it's used in insurance companies. So the risk that we're going to look at is risks that we know about. So the first one is insurance risk. These are the risks that would arise if you're not able to save. First, meet the premiums that you had projected that you'd meet, and secondly, your reserves are not sufficient. So insurance, we all know, right? And this into this presentation, I think there's been a lot of mention on risk, and that's a good thing. So it's not new to every one of us. So the next risk is credit risk. Credit risk is the risk that people who owe you money, which is our policy holders, might default, or your insurance companies default and they fail to give you your recovery. So that would fall under the area of credit risk. Then the other risk is market risk, right? So market risk, if I hope that it is a big thing in your companies right now, because the economy is, not doing well. So this is the risk that you have in case your market keeps fluctuating. We've seen the change in interest rates, our shares, shares of corporates are not performing very well. So this is a big thing, and more reason why you should know about earning such risk. The other thing is operational risk. So this would arise if maybe your models are not working well, and you end up not making, you end up making a loss maybe because of an error in your models, or your people are not, for one reason or another, are not able to do what is expected of them. And just to emphasize on market risk, this is what you're seeing on your screens is a screenshot of a Bloomberg article that was talking about how our stock market is just performing poorly. So next year, 2024, will be a big one on market risk when you're looking at that. So now we'll move to is earnings at risk, what we are talking about here, is it a good measure at the end of the day? So we put up a case for earnings at risk as a good measure or as a coherent risk measure. I know you'll ask yourself, so what's a coherent risk measure? It has 4 characteristics. So, and I'm going to take you through those characteristics of a good risk measure and show you that actually earnings at risk meets those characteristics. The first one is sub-additivity. What does this mean? For any risk measure that you use, even in when you're doing RBC, say you have 2 companies, you have company X and company Y. Company X writes motor policies, company Y writes fire policies, right? Then, for some reason, they decide to merge and form a company Z. Now, company Z will be writing both motor and fire. So the risk that company Z will carry should not exceed the risk that company Y and company Z were carrying when combined. Sawa. So sub-additivity just says that any good risk measure will give you a benefit for diversification, and that's what we're talking about there. And when you're doing your earnings at risk, you need to also cater for a diversification benefit. Alright, so the next characteristic is the characteristic of monotonicity. This, the word was quite difficult to pronounce, but what this means is, if you hold everything constant, if you increase your exposure in your portfolio, then you should expect that your risk will increase in the same proportion. So let me give an example. So say you had 90 motor policies. Then you decide we're going to scale our business, we're going to get more policies, and now you have 1,000 motor policies. The risk that you are carrying by having the 90 policies should increase in line with the exposure that you're carrying. But remember, this is if everything is held constant. So we are saying that nothing changes on your pricing, nothing changes on your economic, such and such. So the other characteristic is the characteristic of positive homogeneity. What this means is, if say you decide we're going to increase our price for motor, the insurance industry saw that an increase in motor prices. So when you increase your motor, the price of your motor policies, what happens on your risk is that it's going to increase by the same constant. So you've increased by about 20%. The risk that you carry, you should see it increasing by about the same percentage. We're together? Perfect. So the last characteristic, and all these earnings at risk calculations, when you get to implement them, which I hope you will in your companies, you're going to see these things. So the last one is I hope you can see it clearly on your screens, it's translation invariance. What this means is, if you have a portfolio, and the example that I'm going to use here is on investment risk. Say you are just carrying corporate bonds. Then you decide we're going to add onto our portfolio some government bonds. Ideally, government bonds are supposed to be risk-free. In our market, I'm not sure, but currently I'm not sure whether it's risk-free, but suppose in an ideal world or in an ideal Kenya, your government bonds were risk-free. So if you decided to add that into your portfolio, then it wouldn't affect the risk that you carry. All right, now that we have that and we presented the case for earnings at risk being a good risk measure, we all know that anything with an advantage has a disadvantage. So we're going to look at the advantages of using earnings at risk as a risk measure in your insurance companies. And so you see that the good thing about earnings at risk, the first one is that just what we presented, that it has the characteristics of a coherent risk measure. The second one is that it focuses on short-term. It focuses on the short-term impacts on the business. So when you look at, say, risk-based capital models or the SAM models for the SA people practicing in SA, is that they look at the extreme events, or say like 1 in 200. I don't know what was used in coming up with the RBC, and they look at the long-term impact. So with the good thing with earnings at risk, it looks at the impact of events on your earnings for, say, the first, second, third year, for about 3 years. So these will be of more interest to our boards and to our management, because it directly, or it has a quicker impact on the P&L. All right. So the other advantage is that earnings at risk looks at a range of scenarios. So it will look at if something happened that affected our equity risk, what would be the impact on our P&L? We combine that with what could happen, what could affect our insurance risk and so forth. So it looks at a range of scenarios, and Sheila will take us through that in a short while. So the other advantage is that it's easy to understand. So what we're saying here is, what is the likelihood of something happening, and how does it impact us? Is that easy? Is it easy to understand so far? We are saying simply that what is the likelihood of an event that could happen in a 1 in 10 year period happening to us, and what's the impact on our P&L or in our profits? So it's easy to understand, and even when you're taking management through, it's simply that. So looking at the cons of earnings at risk, the first con is one of its advantages, so the opposite, is that it looks at a limited time horizon. And with regulators and maybe analysts of a certain, some analysts, they would be interested in looking at the long term, what would happen on the long term. So earnings at risk, one of its cons is that it's used for a short term period. The other thing is that it's very sensitive to your assumptions. So with earnings at risk, you look at, based on your experience as a company, say claims, what could happen in a 1 in 10 year period, maybe claims could go by 20%. So if the next year you use 10%, then your earnings at risk results will be quite different. And the fix for this is to look at what has been happening to your business historically, and use that historical experience to see whether are these calculations making sense or not. The other disadvantage is that earnings at risk will look at a static mix of risks. What this means is, if you have motor business takes like 60% of your book, when you're doing earnings at risk calculations at the beginning of your forecast period, is we assume that nothing will change. You will still write 60% of your book will still be motor. The other thing on maybe I should add here is, earnings at risk also doesn't look at any management actions that are being done, say in the short term. Say you're planning to, you're at the beginning, say you're in January, you've already planned to get 80 million or maybe it could be higher, maybe to 100, and your claims department is actively working because maybe management has said, no, that 80 million is not enough, we need 90. And then, your claims team is working hard. So earnings at risk, unfortunately, doesn't look at that. So the treat for that is you, within the course of the year, you'll keep tracking how you're performing, or against what you said would be the risk that you stand to lose a certain amount of money in the following year. And the last con is that sometimes, if interpreted incorrectly, it could promote a risk-seeking behavior. So, and what we're saying here is that it's always good to use it together with other risk measures. So, and again, the other thing is you should always test your model so that you don't end up giving numbers that are incorrect. So far, so good? Okay, I'll take silence as so far, so good. So, sorry, I'll hand it over to Sheila to take us through the juicy part. I think maybe it will make more sense with the examples. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary. So, we've been accused as non-life people of taking the easy route out. So I will help to show that we are improving. So with earnings at risk, we tried to test this model with 3 Kenyan companies. We used the 2020 financials that are all available online. They are all of similar size, and we've denoted them as A, B, and C. We made some assumptions. So for example, we assumed that until for the next 3 years, they grew by like 10%. And then we made some assumptions based on the shocks that will be applied on earnings at risk. So the same way we have shocks on our RBC is the same way we would have shocks on your earnings at risk, except that they are based on a 1 in 10 year horizon. So you can see, for example, just like RBC, we have equity risk and property risk having higher shocks than cash risk, investment credit risk, and so on. So just to give the distinction between investment credit risk and cash risk and counterparty default risk. So counterparty default risk is the risk that the reinsurers or our policyholders would default. And then investment credit risk is the risk that we would lose out on our deposits, for example, because of the failure of a banking institution, which is still happening in Kenya. And then cash risk would be the risk of actually not getting the kind of returns that you expect on your cash assets. So these are the assumptions that we've made, and based on that, these are the results that we get based on company A, B, and C. And remember, these are all Kenyan companies, so these are actually things that we're seeing in the market. So starting from the right, going backwards to the left, we can see company C has quite a high earnings at risk. If we look at that row there, total risk, that is the total risk of about 5 billion, right? So if you look at what their planned earnings were 1B. So what that means is that their earnings at risk as a percentage of planned earnings is 4.51%. So this company that year probably told their board, wow, we are expecting a 1 billion profit, but if they had had this information, then at least management would have known, yes, we are planning 1B, but in the background we know that not only are we at a risk of not making that 1B, but we have a risk of making a loss that is equals to 3.5 times that 1B. So that is company C, quite a high earnings at risk, and it looks like it's mainly because they are heavily invested in equities and property. As you can see, the equity and property risk risk is quite high, so that is probably what is impacting company C. And maybe it means that they are also not, they have not done their choices in equities. They've not done very good choices in terms of the equities they've invested in. Maybe their properties have been vacant for a long time and so on. Then we go to company B, and we see that company B is similar to company C in terms of the amount of risk. So they also stand to losing 5 billion of their profits. However, for company B, their planned earnings are 9.3 B. What this means is that their earnings at risk as a percentage of planned earnings is much better, it's 58%. What that means is that if you look at their planned profits for the next year, they have a risk of losing 58% of their profits due to different events. So the main difference between company B and C, remember they're of similar size, is that probably company B is probably making better choices in terms of their equities. As you can see, they're heavily invested in equities. Probably they're making good choices on the kind of equities they're investing in. They're getting good returns. Because if you look at their premium risk, it's the same. And also if you look at their reserve risk, it's even higher. Reserve risk normally reflects your claims. So what is happening with company B is that yes, they're heavily invested in equities, but they're getting good returns. And then we go to company A. Company A, total risk is about 2B, and their planned earnings were 1B. So the earnings at risk is 194%. So what we're seeing with company A is that the total risk is much lower than that of the other companies, and as expected, the equity and property risk is actually much lower than company B and C. Then their planned earnings are not as high as company B, so maybe they could have actually gotten some benefit from investing in more equities. However, their earnings are much less volatile. So then now the question would be, what is the correct answer of how your earnings at risk should look like? And I'm going to go into that in the next slide. But before that, the next thing we need to look at, so we've looked at how you can look at the earnings at risk. You need to look at your earnings at risk in context of your planned earnings. But the other thing you need to look at is your risk profile. As a non-life insurer, okay, so forgive us for being non-life insurers, so we are concentrating the example more on non-life. So for a non-life insurer, most of the risk that you should be taking on is insurance risk, right? You're not a bank, you're not an investment company, most of your risk should be non-life risk. So in terms of the risk profile, we can see that company A has a more reasonable risk profile in terms of the kind of business we expect them to write. They have 41% of their risk coming from non-life risk. However, on the other hand, we saw company B making good profits. Their earnings at risk is not very high, but then again, they are probably overexposed to market risk. So then now I will throw the question to you. If you were asked to invest in company A, B, or C, given just the earnings at risk results that you've seen, which company would you invest in? So company A, which we saw has quite a low return on net asset value, but their earnings at risk as a percentage of planned earnings is 2 times. Company B, very good net return on net asset value, but low volatility. And then company C, a medium return on net asset value, but very, very high volatility as measured by their earnings at risk as a percentage of planned earnings. So you can just have some popcorn answers. You don't even need a mic. Just shout out an answer. A, B, or C? A. Okay, Samantha, why would you choose A?
The way the market risk is looking, the exposure, being risk averse, it's like, okay,
Yeah.
it's 2 times less, but,
Yeah.
the market risk is too high, that exposure is too high.
Okay, so you're more on the risk averse side. You're like, okay, you're more, yes, okay, so that's fine. There's someone who said B. Very interesting. Who said B? Oh, there's no one who said B. It was the men, yes. I really want to hear why B?
I'm happy with the high return and the slightly lower risk.
Okay, so you're willing to take on. It doesn't matter whether you're investing mostly in insurance risk. What you care about is profits, and they are not so volatile.
What if it pans out? 16% is good.
Sorry?
16% is good.
Okay, good. Who said company C? Anyone for company C? Okay, I think then let me be company C then. I would choose company C because based on the return on net asset value, it's not as low as company A, but it's not as low as company A. So at least it's like 8%, somewhere between the two. And as much as its earnings at risk is high as a percentage of planned earnings, we have, now I'm in the shoes of company C, we have a long-term strategy. And so this is what you're seeing in the short term. However, if we were to look at a longer horizon, we have a strategy, don't worry. Safaricom will perform poorly for the next 5 years. So anyway, so the answer is there is no right answer. It all depends on your risk appetite. As Samantha said, if you're more risk averse, you would probably choose company A and not company C. Someone who is more risk taking can go for probably even company C because they're willing to take on more risk. If the main thing you care about is your returns, then you go for company B, whether you're investing in equities or non-life. For those of us who work for groups of companies, you'll be told no, there's compliance, you cannot have most of your risk in market risk, so you'll be told no, most of your risk has to be in non-life, so we'll go with company A, because we saw most of their risk is in non-life. So that's the thing, there's no correct answer when it comes to earnings at risk. You have to take into account your risk appetite, which then begs the question, how many of us work for employers where we have defined our risk appetite? Okay, we have. Yeah, so actually that is the homework that we need to do first. Even before we come up with earnings at risk calculations, we first need to define what is our risk appetite measure. Then that will inform us about the actions that we need to take based on the results that we get. And then maybe the last thing I'll say before I hand over to Mary is, of course, if you were to make a decision based on these 3 companies, there's other metrics as well that you need to look at as well. Those things will be in 61, internal rate of return and all that. So, of course, earnings at risk, as Mary said, is not a metric that you can use in isolation. It just adds more information to all the other decisions that you will make between different investments or different portfolios. So back over to you, Mary, to conclude.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I hope the examples have now brought everything into context, right? Right, so now to conclude it all, so what are we trying to say? What we're trying to say is, in conclusion, is that earnings at risk is a useful risk management tool that we can use in our companies, and especially in the past we've been looking back. Now we need to start looking forward, and I've had complaints where the management will say, you actuaries only come in when it is bad, right? So let us start engaging when things are not bad yet. So earnings at risk could help you with that. The other thing is that it could be used to evaluate companies, to evaluate portfolios, to evaluate products, depending on how granular your calculations are, how granular your assumptions are. So it's a good tool to help with that. And especially say you're in a group where you have very many subsidiaries, you can tell, this one, or this one we need to put more money in it. The other thing is what Sheila has just mentioned. This is a good conversation starter on risk appetite. In the past, you'll find actuaries have not been, we've not been that involved in risk management, but now here we are presenting you with an opportunity to help the business start or kickstart a good risk management framework. And the first thing is to define your risk appetite. Are we risk averse? Are we risk taking? And what are we willing to put on the line? That marks the end of our presentation. We hope that we have contributed to your learning in this convention, and we will welcome questions.
Take two questions.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Sheila, for that insightful presentation. So just a quick one. So is it safe to say that earnings at risk is really for short-term businesses? Because you said it's looking at the variation between like 10 years occurrence, and also the results is for just the short-term basis. So how is it applicable to long-term businesses like life insurance?
Okay, I can take that. Okay, thank you, Charles, for that question. Earnings at risk is not only for short-term insurers. Remember, we are saying that you're coming with scenarios that could happen in a 1 in 10 year period. for the next forecast period. So at the end of every year, whether you're life or non-life, we report some profits, right? We have to look at profits. So maybe the assumptions or the shocks that you do for non-life, or the risks that you look at for non-life and life would vary in terms of intensity. But for say like life companies, they do carry some equity risk, and they have, they get something at the end of the year, also on claims. So it's for all insurance companies. It's just that the examples we gave were non-life. Right.
So for a life insurer, in terms of insurance risk, you'd use mortality risk, longevity risk, and so on. So yes, it still will be relevant, because as much as it's a long-term risk, you're looking at just the profits over the next 1-2 years.
Thank you very much for such a good presentation. I think for me, I look at this as an novelty. It's a novelty. And one of the characteristics of this earnings is I was comparing it, because it says that downside risk, was comparing the properties with what you know, value at risk, because that is a very common way in which you can able to measure risk. Okay? So in your case, earning as risk mostly deals with earnings. Value at risk mostly deals with the liability in assets and how the company grows. And you say it's a short term. So I was looking at, is there any way, probably you have done your illustration using, compare it with this value at risk and see how the risk moves, so that you can able to make that conclusion that, okay, we've been using value at risk to do these things, but now if you try to use earnings at risk, the results will be much better, and you're able to make a better prediction about the prospects of the company from the earnings, now that you shape the short term. So maybe, I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, and if so, when we use value at risk, we always give some chance, okay? Because when you're measuring risk, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you are telling people you're going to be 100% sure you're getting problems. So you have to give yourself room. So does it have a room, say that we're going to measure it at a certain percentage, only in so that you be safe? Question.
I think that's a request for part 2. So in the next convention, tune in for part 2.
Yeah, but thank you very much for those comments. All right, that's our time. Thank you very much.